Great. Well, thanks for everyone for joining us today. We're excited to have you and welcome to today's webinar, Driving a Global Compliance Strategy in a Shifting Landscape. We wanted to start with a few housekeeping items before we dive in. First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Andrea Palmater. I am Director of Advice and Analytics here at Syndio. I want to start out by letting you know the information we're providing is not intended as legal advice. It's for informational purposes only. Also want to note a few Zoom features that are enabled here. You have the option of doing a live transcript through Zoom. If you'd like that, please turn on closed captioning, which is a setting found in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. For privacy purposes, attendee audio and video have been disabled and the attendee list has been hidden. Also want to note that we've reserved time at the end of this conversation for Q&A, so please submit your questions as we go, and we'll make sure we get to as many as possible at the end of the hour. And finally, wanted to note that this webinar is being recorded. After this, we'll send you a recording of the webinar as well as the slides, so you'll have those follow-up materials. And then lastly, you'll be receiving a short survey after this. Please fill that out to provide us with feedback. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Christine and I who are speaking today are from Syndio, and wanted to give you a little bit of background about Syndio. Syndio is the #1 pay transparency solution. We work with the companies you see here on the screen, but many more confidentially. We have hundreds of customers and have analyzed data for over 10 million employees. And what differentiates us from other folks in the mix looking at these tough problems of HR analytics relating to pay equity and other issues is the sophisticated technology solutions we offer, combined with expert advice, spanning legal best practices, custom statistical analysis, reporting, and communications. And today we'll have the two folks you see on the screen here. So me, Andrea Palmater, I'm our Director of Advice and Analytics. I lead our domain expert team, focused on working with our customers, thinking about how to analyze their data, interpret it, act on it, and communicate about it, both looking in the US and globally. And Christine, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Christine Hendrickson. Looking at the attendee list, it's really nice to see so many folks that I've been lucky enough to work with, and some new names and faces too. But I sit on Syndio's strategy team. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives. I'm a labor and employment attorney by background. I was previously the co-chair of the Pay Equity Group at Cypher Shaw. But at Syndio, I work with our customers around the intersection of the regulatory environment and all of these reporting laws, especially the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and how that impacts their approach. So we don't provide legal advice at Syndio, and although I am a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer. We wanted to provide some information, and this is really informed. Andrea and I are here kind of as representatives of our domain team, but our domain team is really diverse in terms of the types of work that we do. So Andrea wears the hat of doing all of the analytics and comes from that background. But we have Nancy Romanishin, who wears a total rewards background, Stefan Gartner, who recently joined us from Aon. We have many amazing labor economists on our team as well, and Andrea's team, as well as individuals who come to us from doing communications and elsewhere. So really thrilled to be with you today. And so we're going to share some information, but it's really informed by the broad and rich experience of the teams that we're lucky enough to work with at Syndio.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Excited for our conversation today.
Me too.
So wanted to share here the agenda for today's conversation. First, we'll have an overview really about where we stand today, what's on the horizon, some of the trends that we're seeing in this landscape of compliance. From there, we'll talk about best practices we've seen working with our customers, for tangible steps you can take towards global transparency and compliance strategy. We'll summarize some key takeaways, and then, of course, leave some time for Q&A at the end. So Christine, I'll hand it over to you to kick us off talking about where we stand today.
Yeah, Andrea, we've talked about this a lot, but I mean, I've never seen a landscape that is kind of shifting. We have these crosswinds that are happening in a way that I haven't seen the complexity before. So we've certainly seen waves of laws come and go, but this crosswinds is really difficult for employers to navigate. So our hearts truly go out to all of the legal and total rewards leaders that are on compliance and HR leaders that are on this call, because it's hard right now. What you're facing is really challenging. We have, on one hand, the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the CSRD looming. We're down to just a single pay cycle left to address any issues as the right to information, where we're having to share out pay gaps at least the individual level, going live in 2026, reporting starting in 2027. We also have an onslaught in the US of executive action. So we have, of course, the Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity executive order that came out in January, but there's a lot more, and that landscape is shifting and changing. We also are hearing just more pressure for employers to prove that they can explain the reasons for their pay, that they can explain the reasons why they're rating employees. And so this shifting landscape is when Andrea and I were talking about like wanting to do a webinar around this, and it was really born out of the fact that a lot of our Syndio customers that both Andrea and I are working with day in, day out are trying to navigate this landscape. And so that's really what we're trying to do in this webinar, is just to talk through what's on the horizon, and then how can we navigate? How do you chart a course that navigates through all of this? And that's what we really tried to do at Syndio, and what we want to do during this webinar. Okay, so we wanted to start with the US. What has changed under the US Trump administration? The first thing that's changed is the OFCCP's core function. So for those that are federal contractors in the US, you will know this very, very well, but we have folks from around the globe who may not be as aware of who the OFCCP is and what they do. So in the US, we had two key civil rights agencies that enforce the anti-discrimination and affirmative action laws in the US. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the OFCCP. And the OFCCP enforced those obligations for companies that did business with the federal government at a certain relatively low threshold. So what happened with the illegal DEI executive order is that President Trump rescinded Executive Order 11246. And so that means that all of the kind of core requirements that the OFCCP enforced in terms of non-discrimination, including with respect to pay equity, all went away. And employers are not required to prepare at least the kind of core affirmative action plans that were required by the OFCCP. There's also this intense focus on kind of what the Trump administration has deemed rooting out what they're calling illegal DE&I. This portion of it is currently, or at least some core components of the illegal DE&I are right now stayed. There was a preliminary injunction around the enforcement of the illegal DE&I. And then we have the EEOC, which was the other regulatory agency. President Trump terminated the pay of there are 5 independent bipartisan commissioners of the EEOC. When Trump entered office, there were 4 of the 5 roles were filled, 3 by Democrats, 1 by a Republican, and there was an empty seat that was previously filled by a Republican. When President Trump entered into office, he terminated 2 of the 3 Democrats. So right now the EEOC lacks quorum. And so that's what's happening at the federal level. But there's a lot that has not changed. Much more has not changed, especially in the pay equity space, than has changed. Most importantly, the US federal equal pay laws have not changed. The Title VII, the Equal Pay Act, which were jointly enforced by the EEOC and the OFCCP, those continue. all of the state laws, those remain, and the EEOC's core function still remains. Kind of maybe more importantly, if I was channeling Nancy Romanishin, who, like many of you, comes from a total rewards background. I think that she would say that, your core job hasn't changed, because of course, there's still this need to explain why people are paid what they're paid, to have consistency in that. And then there's also employees that are demanding more information and more transparency. So a lot has not changed. This is particularly the case in the pay equity space. So there was a great question about what is considered illegal DE&I. What's the definition of it? The reality is that the executive order didn't define it, and that was the reason that the plaintiffs were able to seek and obtain a preliminary injunction of some of the certification and termination provisions and the like of that, because they didn't define it. They didn't provide a definition of what it means to have illegal DE&I. And so for that reason, the judge said, nope, there's not enough information. It's vague. It's unconstitutionally vague. And so it's currently on hold. But if we look towards what is happening in terms of the private lawsuits around these illegal DE&I obligations, you'll see that they're mainly around selection. So hiring, who's being selected for new roles, for promotion, who's selected for mentorship or apprenticeship programs, who's selected for who's terminated in a RIF or the like. There's a little bit around stipends and allowances, primarily around abortion travel stipends, a little bit around an employer who had vehicle allowances that may have had some differentiation based upon race. But most of those claims are around selection. Right now, if we look at across all of these kind of 45 companies that Bloomberg identified as being on the MAGA anti-DEI hit list, that was their terminology. None of them reference or are focused upon pay equity. So we're not seeing the impact on illegal DE&I on pay equity. And the go forward is definitely what we're hearing from our customers. Andrea and the team at Syndio has done a couple of customer conversations, and in those conversations and roundtables, and in those conversations, what we're hearing is, kind of people are moving forward with their pay equity. It's not the area that is currently under attack. We're going to be doing a much deeper dive into everything around the U.S. executive orders on pay equity. We're going to do an Ask Me Anything with Katie Bardaro and Rob Porcarelli on March 19th. So I hope you will be able to join us for that, because that will be, we can get a lot deeper into everything that's there, and then anything that's shifted between now and then.
And Christine, I'll just add to that point about pay equity. One of the reasons we're seeing zero concerns is really the spirit of this sort of shift and focus on illegal DEI is sort of a perceived disadvantage to white employees and men. Pay equity analytics and the way that pay equity has always been structured is a bilateral, where we want to see equity across all groups. In our analyses at Syndio, working with our customers, we've always identified any group, no matter what their background, whether they're a historically disadvantaged group or not. If they're paid lower in a systemic way, we would want to adjust that. We see about 20% of the time in our customer data that it's men or white employees who are getting those adjustments. So because it's been an approach that has addressed concerns across the board, it's not being targeted as much.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating research. One of the research economists that's on Andrea's team did that a study and found that 85% the results were neutral, but yeah, 1 in 5, very interesting, really interesting, and corrected bidirectionally. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in more detail. And then on the other hand, we have the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive looms quite large. Right now, with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, there will be 48 jurisdictions across 43 countries that will require some kind of pay gap analysis. There's some places like in Canada, multiple provinces, in the US, multiple states, et cetera, where there are even more, the landscape is even more complex. But half of those, so 27, over half of those will either be new requirements or modified by 2027. So it's quite an onerous landscape. We also have this shift to greater transparency and reporting happening very soon. So the requirements will go into effect for things like right to information, pay scale disclosure across the EU, effective in 2026 when those laws are transposed, which must happen by June of 2026. And then we have, for the first report due in 2027, a higher threshold at 150 plus, although it's quite likely that we're going to see that threshold lowered. There are 13 of the 27 member states currently have pay gap reporting laws, and 11 of those 13 have thresholds that are lower than 150. So we should expect that we're going to see lowered thresholds. We're also hearing out of places like Croatia that although there's no current law there, that the idea is that that threshold will be lowered, as so few employers would otherwise be subject to those pay reporting requirements. So I think that we're going to see a lot more reporting coming, and it's coming really soon. So that's. And then we're still like a long road to fully transposing the EU Pay Transparency Directive. We have drafts out of Belgium, Poland, Ireland, and Sweden. I will say Belgium is a big kind of caveat. Question, should it be yellow? Should it be green? Because it only impacts about less than 10,000, about 7,500, mostly public sector employees in the FWB, and so it has quite a limited impact. And then in other places like Poland, we're a little bit back to the drawing board. In Ireland, the transposition is only a partial draft. So we don't have any information on the reporting pieces of it. It only was around the pay scale disclosure and the like. But if early lessons are any indication, what we're hearing is that we're going to have differentiation jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So in the draft in Poland, again, back to the drawing board there, but in Ireland as well, they gold-plated the directive, so are requiring things like the pay scale to be posted on the actual job posting itself. Sweden indicated that it intends to keep, if the draft goes forward, keep with its existing reporting requirements, and only keep those, add on the requirements of the overall pay gap and add some new requirements as well. So a complex environment that you're all facing. Again, this is something that we're hearing day in, day out, is that we're just navigating a really quite complex area. And of course, these requirements are not something that only impacts on the EU and in the US. We also have reporting requirements, increasing numbers in South America of pay gap reporting requirements, more pay reporting requirements in a very public way in Australia, reporting requirements in Japan and Israel, and again, it's really a global phenomenon. So Andrea, I think that we wanted to step into the shoes of not a real customer, but like a hypothetical customer, but not dissimilar. And we actually really skinnied this down to make it as non-complex as we possibly could, and you'll still see the complexity there. But we have customers that have employees in, when they look at all 40, they'll have it in like 39 of the 43 countries that have pay reporting requirements, and many more jurisdictions over there. But this is a less complex view, but I would love to hear what you're hearing from customers on this.
Absolutely. So this is something like Christine said, we wanted to think through, as we have this conversation in this webinar, what does this look like for a real company, in practice, working through the various jurisdictions with all of these different requirements. And so develop this sort of fictional company we're calling Nova Global Solutions that we'll reference throughout our conversation today. So this the sort of lens we're taking with this is a large multinational company, US based, with presence in a lot of states that have uh, state specific regulations, as well as countries in the EU and elsewhere that have reporting requirements, and that both now and coming on board as part of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Large federal contractor, and then a wide variety of technical roles, manufacturing, supply chain roles, operational. So really kind of touching all of the different components that may arise with your organization. So I want to take a moment to talk about the kinds of challenges that a lot of our customers are kind of facing right now. Total rewards leaders are trying to design their pay programs to be compliant, competitive, and efficient, but compliant with all of these different shifting requirements is a lot to keep track of. There's sort of a disconnect between the policies that they're trying to set internally aligned with this sort of constant shifting guidelines, new ones being added with the EU Pay Transparency Directive coming online in 2027, and then actually having to be implemented by frontline managers, recruiters, other people who make pay decisions. And this is your biggest line item, but something that you have to have a really strong policy for, and then really strong implementation for. So in order to do that, we've been working with our customers to help manage a sort of centralized process, to think about, in a company like Nova Global Solutions, how do we manage all of the different parts globally, these different laws, our different stakeholders. And so we've really sort of narrowed this down to 4 different steps. First, to get prepared, get yourself organized, analyze your data, figure out what actions you need to take based on that analysis, and then communicate about the actions you've taken and the results you've seen. And so, Christine, I'll leave it to you to sort of talk about what preparation looks like.
Yeah, so I think that these are the kinds of questions that we often hear for employers are like, and is one, what are our core goals around pay equity and transparency? And are these shifting based on the new landscape? So I feel like this is a conversation that Andrea and I are having on like a near daily basis about like, how do we navigate this new world? And so I do think that like part of it, the first step is really just to get grounded on what that is. The other question that we get a lot is like, what applies to me? How do we know what applies to me in this space? How will this work be done? And then like, when are we obligated to act? And what is a compliance timeline look like? So when we think of your goals, it's really, if we want to go to the next slide, we'd want to look at it from multiple lenses, from the employee lens, from your leaders and manager, from the lens of your leaders and managers, from all of the total rewards and legal partners. And of course, there are many other stakeholders. So you have your talent acquisition and your talent management teams who are key stakeholders. Your comms team is a key stakeholder, but understanding kind of what your goals are. And what we're really finding is that although the landscape is really complex and shifting, a lot of these things remain pretty constant, that we want to make sure to drive pay at your organization based on things that you want to be paying for. So if you think that you're paying for performance, are you actually paying for performance? If you think that we're having consistency, do we actually have consistency? Are people going to be within the ranges that are now going to be quite public? They are quite public in many places in the US and Canada, elsewhere, and are going to become the case become so even to a greater extent across Europe with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. All of these are pretty foundational, and they don't shift that much in this landscape. So I think that keeping your North Star kind of where it's been, there are going to be some shifts that that you may need to make. I mean, Andrea is going to talk about that in terms of like how we approach the analysis, but those core goals we're finding are fairly consistent. Although how you talk about them and how you communicate them is shifting a fair amount, and we'll also talk about that. Then we'd want to understand like what applies to us. So there's those kind of three buckets of laws that prevent you from discriminating or requires that you pay people in an equal manner. And those often fall into those kind of anti-discrimination or DE&I laws. And those are pretty consistent across the globe. So most countries have an anti-discrimination law or many anti-discrimination laws. So in the US, of course, we have, as we mentioned, the Equal Pay Act and Title VII. We have state law equivalents across the board. There's pay reporting and transparency laws that NOVA is subject to. We called out just California, Illinois, Minnesota, and New York because that's where they have people. And we called out these locations because that's NOVA's footprint. But again, but this is the case even if you're in 50 countries or you're an employer that's in 5 countries. No matter where you are, there's a complexity that happens at both the state level, the federal or provincial level, or division or regional level, at the country level, and sometimes more granularly. And then we have the pay reporting laws. So this indicates that this employer NOVA is subject to reporting in California, Illinois, Minnesota, Germany, UK, and Australia. And this is pretty typical, is that, that oftentimes what we're finding is that employers have reporting in a lot of the jurisdictions that they have. And then Poland's on the horizon. So they don't currently have reporting obligations in Poland, but will as a result of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So one of the things that I'd recommend starting with is really just getting your arms around the like who, what, when, and where of all of these laws. And so Syndio just put out a new pay gap reporting hub, and I would love for you to look at it because it's really, I think, really useful. It was something that it was the brainchild of many people at Syndio, and it really answers all of those key requirements. So every jurisdiction that has current pay reporting laws, there's going to be even some more that are coming online and on board here soon. We also have some like Massachusetts where there's not actually current pay gap reporting laws, but there's some complexity around that. Or New Zealand, we also have blogs for those. So for all of the jurisdictions, you can like click into any of the jurisdictions. So if I was sitting there and I was in NOVA, I know that I have reporting obligations in Australia. I have them in the US, in California, Illinois, Minnesota. I have reporting obligations in Poland, in Germany, and the UK. So there's a reporting guide for each of those. So if we wanted to click on one of those, Lauren, like maybe, yeah, exactly. Thanks, Lauren. Lauren's our guru of all things webinars, so she's just pulling up these, and this shows you the answers to the questions of like when are the reports due, who is subject to the reporting obligations, what has to be filed, so it identifies what metrics need to be done, where those have to be shared out, and then it has some answers to some frequently asked questions. Stay alert to even more information on like frequently asked questions, because we're just about to do a big launch around that as well. So feel free to look through that. I think that Lauren listed, but that's where I would start if I were NOVA, is to get my arms around like where are my reporting obligations, what am I subject to, how do I report on that. The next thing that that we often are hearing is, how is this work going to get done? employers often are doing this in a kind of combination of ways, in a very decentralized way where each team is responsible for doing their own reporting obligations. So France is responsible for, or to use Nova, the team in the UK is responsible for doing reporting in the UK. The team in California handles the reporting in California and the like. But we're finding there's a much more, as this gets both much more complex and much more public, where everyone is going to have to tell their story in a very public way, that employers are more and more moving to either one of these other options. So a hub and spoke, meaning that there's a center, either a center of excellence or a centralized team who is supporting those local teams so that they're telling a consistent story, or increasingly more employers moving to a more centralized model. What we often are finding is that it's just becoming like kind of unruly now that we have reporting across 48 different jurisdictions all around the world. And there's all of these competing deadlines just to have a way to provide that. So Syndio does that. We support the reporting in all 48 jurisdictions for folks that don't know through our global pay reports. And we do that. There's so many good questions that I love these questions that are coming in. Keep them coming, and then we'll answer them as we get to the end. Lots of questions around, how is this doing this? Who's handling this work? So we'll get into those. Okay. And then just putting it all together around a timeline and a calendar, that's something that Syndio is increasingly helping with in terms of managing all of those deadlines. So again, if we look at a 2025, 2026 calendar, it may be, again, this is just for Nova. So they just have the report, they just have those 5 countries that they're in. You can imagine this is a much more complex calendar for employers that have employees across many, many jurisdictions. But some of the key things that we're seeing is that employers are starting to do preliminary pay equity reviews for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, evaluating how they want to group employees and what justifications they'll use for that process. So Andrea, that's where we're going to head next, is what should we do? Like, how do we analyze this? How would you undertake this, Andrea?
Absolutely. And the thing about having all of these different jurisdictions with different requirements is they all require different analyses to answer the particular question that jurisdiction is looking to address. So first bucket, global pay reporting. So this is both within certain US states, California, Illinois, Minnesota, and then many jurisdictions or many countries around the world, including every EU country in 2027 and certain ones right now in the EU. Excuse me, and bear with me and my voice. I'm like many people had the flu last week and my voice hasn't fully come back yet. But each of these jurisdictions is looking to address a slightly different question around pay fairness, and is therefore looking at different metrics that you have to report on, either by filing a report with the government, sharing publicly, sharing with your employees, or just maintaining information on record in case there's a request for information from an employee. So sometimes this is pay gap, largely unadjusted pay gap, looking at the average, say, average pay of men and women within your organization, base pay, bonuses, various forms of compensation. Others look at regression analysis. So let's factor in your control values, those neutral job-related factors that you would use to differentiate pay. And it's a registry where you have to just keep on file information about different roles and what their compensation is, the range, so that employees can request that information. So a variety of things, and the reporting hub that Christine just highlighted is a great way to get more information on a particular jurisdiction. Do you have employees there? Do you meet the threshold, therefore, of employees that you would need to then do this reporting? And then what are the requirements? And Syndio does support our customers in doing many of those reports.
Yeah, I love that part of the Syndio. I think that like we have the laser focus on doing those individual reports across all of those 48 jurisdictions where there's reporting. But we also, in the Syndio PayEQ platform, you can personalize so that if you wanted to look at statistically significant gaps, you can, 5% gaps, all of that. Yeah, like almost like a Swiss Army knife or something.
Exactly. Great. And sort of very much intertwined with that is this idea of work of equal pay for work of equal value within the EU, which is when the EU Pay Transparency Directive requirements come online and reporting is required in 2027, it's going to ask employers who have employees in EU countries to identify places where they have 5% gaps between men and women and how they're paid. Employers do have the opportunity to explain why there be a 5% gap, which we can do with a regression analysis. So we're working with many of our customers right now on conducting analyses of, okay, let's identify who does work of equal value. Let's look for gender gaps. Let's see if we can use neutral job-related factors to explain those gaps. And if not, we need to be making pay adjustments now to close that gap because that 2027 reporting is based on 2026 data. A lot of activity there now to do that preparatory work in the EU to set ourselves up well for that global pay reporting piece that's going to come online because of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And then we continue to work with our customers as well on pay equity, as we talked about earlier, even though there's been a lot of really big shifts in the political landscape within the US, pay equity is really unchanged. It's still something where bi-directionally, we want to make sure we're closing gaps between employees. And you can see we note both closing those gaps and talking about compensation consistency. There's a couple different methodologies we can use to assess pay equity, and we'll talk about that a couple slides from now. But first, want to shift a little bit to talking about, different ways we could assess pay equity. Something we've done historically is looking globally, same methodology across the board, largely focused on things we see in the US, like grouping together employees who do substantially similar work based on skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions. We're analyzing often targets to use it as part of compensation planning to close any gaps we identify based on statistical significance. So looking at p-value or standard deviation, saying we're seeing a statistical pattern here where there's a gap and we want to close that, factoring in neutral job-related factors. We've also got CSRD, big presence in Europe, which is really focused on global employees and not factoring in these neutral job-related factors, just looking at this sort of unadjusted gap across the board, total pay for employees, where are we seeing issues? And then finally, as we mentioned with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, we're grouping employees slightly differently again, looking at performing the same work and work of equal value, making sure there's no gaps there, rather than looking at statistical significance or just a broad unadjusted gap. We're looking at those 5% gaps for each group. And then we do need to get below that 5% gap if we can't explain them. And if you hit that 2027 date, June 2027, report out your numbers based on your calendar year 2026 data, and you have gaps greater than 5%, that triggers a joint pay assessment with your works councils. So something that our customers are trying to work to avoid that additional work. And if we want to shift to the next one, we can talk a little bit more about the different types of analyses we can be looking at to do with this question of pay equity. Kind of addresses across the board, but particularly in the US, this is the kind of questions we can be looking at. Something we've been seeing a little bit of a shift in. So pay equity analysis, we're asking the question, do race or gender impact pay? We're using a linear regression focused on protected class to eliminate gaps. We've actually seen a little bit of a shift in methodology in terms of how our customers are approaching this. Historically, a lot of them have sort of framed this around the analysis around doing comparisons that show up in lawsuits. So things like, okay, are men paid differently than women? Are we seeing a gap there? Are various races paid differently than white employees, since white employees are historically the highest paid? We've had more and more customers come to us asking to do a slightly different methodology that we refer to as highest paid race, which sort of says, okay, let's not, based on the sort of trends we're seeing from the executive orders, we want to sort of not make the assumption that men and white employees are the highest paid. Let's shift around and sort of assess group by group who our comparative group should be and make any adjustments against that. So certainly Syndio supports our customers in both, but we are seeing a little bit of a shift towards that second group, as well as a lot of interest in this bucket you see here on the right, which is a consistency analysis, which is really about, our payers or our managers paying as we intend. And it doesn't factor in race or gender at all into the analysis. It just says, these are our neutral job related factors that we want to be paying for. Um, are are we seeing employees who are either paid too high or too low, or we need to manage that either with uh, pay adjustments for the low employees or some kind of long-term plan to engage consistency with the highly paid folks. Of course, consistency leads to equity. So if you're managing your pay by checking consistency against uh, um, your pay policies, and then also using something like, our pay finder tool has been something that has been really helpful for our customers to help set starting pay and pay at promotion and transfer time to make sure that's consistent. It helps eliminate those pay inequities without having to directly look at race and gender. And you can see a little bit more information about that. This is something that we support our customers with to help identify those employees who are not paid according to policy, identifying what outliers have in common to understand, are there trends in the way managers are making pay decisions, pinpointing populations you want to examine more closely, and also understand, if we want to make pay adjustments to underpaid employees, let's identify who they are, how much they need to be changed in order to make them consistent with others.
Yeah, I love that. I love that that framing, Andrea. Like, because to me, like the big takeaways from this is make sure that we're doing it bidirectionally, make sure that you're doing the right analysis for the right reason. So if you're sitting in the EU, and you should really be focused on those gaps of greater than 5% in those categories of work or in those equal value groupings. So I love that. I think that those are so meaningful. And then as you said, like to look at consistency as well, to make sure that you're looking at consistency and determining really what's driving those gaps. I really love that. So that goes into really like, what do we do next? Like, how do we act upon these results? And that's exactly what I would do. So I would dive into where my problem areas are on my reporting. This is really, your global pay reports are your opportunity to have a conversation with your employees, with applicants, with shareholders, with your leaders around where you are on pay equity. When they're public, you have to explain them. And so taking the time to be able to understand like what's driving those gaps can be really, really helpful. Focusing on the right groupings and controls that we're hearing a lot about. I think that one big looming question that we hear all of the time is like, do I need a new job architecture? And it really depends on, do you have a job architecture, and is it made for this moment in the EU? If I were sitting in your shoes, the first thing I would do is I would test it. So I would take if I were an employer, most of our Syndio customers are large employers that have worked with one of the big consultancies on putting together an incredibly detailed job architecture. And there's so much that goes into developing that. I would evaluate whether or not do an analysis, do a pilot, and figure out if we could leverage our job architecture for the purposes of those equal value groupings before you kind of throw it all up in the air. And so Stefan Gartner, who also sits on the strategy team, and Nancy Romanishin, one ex Aon 1X WTW. I think that that's really where their heads are too. I would start that process of remediating unexplained 5% gaps. The right to information is going to go live in advance of your pay gap reporting, and so it may be things that you want to start working on and start closing this year, and then document your methodology. In the US, I would do exactly what you said, Andrea. I'd remediate the statistically significant gaps. I still think that that's the best way. I'd really make sure that you're looking bidirectionally. So if the Syndio platform as default will flag and budget for gaps, no matter who is the impacted group. If for whatever reason you were doing it in a different way, you may want to reevaluate whether that or not that still makes sense for your organization. Okay, if we want to go to the next slide. Okay, and then resolve. Some jurisdictions will require that you actually close the gaps. I think that that's one of the things that's most revolutionary with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It's not the only law that requires this, but it is one of the laws that requires it in the most significant way, which is if there are gaps of greater than 5%, that we have to be able to justify them or close them. So look at starting pay, performance, ensure consistency, and then consider partnering with your Syndio team for a root cause analysis. So that's how I'd act. Now the next one is like probably the hard one, Andrea, like how do you communicate about this? And then we'll leave the last 5 minutes for questions.
Exactly. This is something that, is that we're, thus far we've been sort of working internally with our team, maybe our comp team, maybe a slightly broader set of stakeholders. But a lot of this has to go public in some way. So for example, in the UK, which is one of our Nova Global Solutions locations, you are required to publish your metrics publicly. It's just 6 metrics, can be plain and simple. You could just put up a little table with those numbers on your website. But most of our customers that we work with really want to craft a narrative to contextualize those metrics, to tell the story behind them about, why we might be still seeing a gap, what work is being done to correct it. Then as part of the equal pay or the pay equity work for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, there's communication that needs to be done about the analysis, like working with works councils. You're required to consult with them and share your methodology about, you've said we can explain these 5% gaps. How are we explaining them? What does that mean? So that communication piece with those key stakeholders on your works councils or employee representatives is really important. And then, on the US side, where we're looking at pay equity, even though there's no reporting required, this is largely for internal management around, prevention of lawsuits and maintenance of employer brand and that kind of thing, is to if you're doing the work, give yourself credit for it. Share that out, tell your story, make your employees feel valued to help improve morale, and then also make sure that you're showing to potential candidates that you're investing in this as part of your employer brand strategy. And we can talk a little bit more on the next slide about what some of this looks like. So for this global pay reporting piece where you're required to calculate these metrics jurisdiction by jurisdiction, just like every jurisdiction has different metrics you have to look at, you also have different ways you have to report them out. So some you have to submit to a government entity, some you have to post publicly, some you have to share your results with employees or a works council, and some you just have to keep them on file, and employees are allowed to make requests for that information. So different contexts, some requiring that proactive communication, some not, but then you have the option to say, I want to be more proactive. I've done this work. What story do I want to tell? So if you've done the analytics, you've got great data to provide context around it. We also see a lot of our customers sharing initiatives they're doing. If we're seeing places where there are gaps or room for improvement, what work are you doing to make improvements there? And of course, you want to consider any risks associated with if you're sharing bad numbers. What's that going to do to your employer brand, to your employee morale, and how can we get ahead of making sure that if there's concerning numbers, how can we reassure the folks that we want to have confidence in us in the way we pay?
Yeah, I think that like we're hearing a lot of, if we want to go to the next slide, it flows into those key takeaways. That taking action on the analysis and the communication piece is a big part of it. One thing that we're hearing is that employers are a little more reluctant, especially in the US, to share out those results, as they don't want to become a target. And one of the things that I would say is that there's a lot that you're going to have. There's a lot of the story that you're still going to have to share. So you're still going to have to share out your pay ranges in the US. You're still going to have to share out in a public way your pay gap reports in many, many countries. So you're going to have a communication strategy, even if you decide to not publish or include in your ESG reports or sustainability reports information. The CSRD is going to require that you're talking about pay equity. So I think that it's like inevitable that you're going to have a communication strategy, and what that looks like is probably going to differ country to country. So again, I think we think fair pay, definitely we're still seeing that as an area that hasn't been the target of any of this kind of illegal DEI action in the US. A lot of growing momentum around the pay reporting requirements and that kind of more thoughtful, centralized approach to keep track of that is a trend that we're seeing in the future. We have a couple minutes, and so we have some awesome questions. So Andrea, can I ask you one?
Sure.
One of the questions is we've been talking about centralization, who often, which HR function is typically handling it from a centralized standpoint?
No, we typically see that coming from a compensation team.
Yeah.
Because they've got access to a lot of the data, particularly any HRIS data around pay, and also have the opportunities to make adjustments and be thinking about that if adjustments need to be made. They're working in partnership with local teams. A lot of the jurisdiction reporting requirements depend on actual payout, so payroll data, which tends to be scattered across a lot of different databases in different countries. So
Yeah.
that's a big point of coordination, is to have that team there to help work with the local team, say, these are the data points we need, let's pull them from your system and get those analytics run.
Yeah, great. We have another question that I can take, which is the scope of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So the question is, will the directive's requirements apply to US companies for legal entities outside of the EU? And the answer is, it does impact US companies, but not for employees that are outside of the EU on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So even if you have a very small number of employees in Europe, remember that the right to information, the requirement to share pay ranges, the requirement not to ask questions about prior pay, that will apply across the board. If you meet the larger reporting threshold, then it will also apply, but only apply for your employees that are located in the EU. There is an overlapping requirement around the CSRD. It's a different reporting requirement, and the total rewards is just a tiny slice, and the reporting thresholds are a little different. So it applies to different employers, but there you have to report out on a global pay gap, which would include employees that are outside of the EU for that overall median gap. So again, it doesn't apply exactly tick to tack to different reporting requirements, but really good question.
And I'll just tag with that.
Yeah, please.
We have tons and tons of resources going really, really deep on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, both webinars, blogs, all that kind of stuff. So those resources are available if you want to learn more.
Perfect. And then there was another question, and Lauren, maybe we have got Lauren is our amazing guru of all things webinars. So Lauren, if you wouldn't mind dropping any of those into the chat, that would be fantastic on the EU Pay Transparency Directive Hub. You can also get to it from the Reporting Hub. And yeah. There also, from the Reporting Hub, you can also access the our second question is about whether or not we have a summary of the pay transparency requirements and anti-discrimination in addition to the pay gap reporting laws. So the pay gap reporting, the Reporting Hub applies to keeps track of all of the transparency obligations in US and Canada. as well as all of the reporting obligations all around the world. And so we have trackers and all of that. The blogs also maintain and call out those transparency requirements. We don't have anything right now that maintains all of the anti-discrimination laws, although you can be rest assured that in almost every country they apply. So, and that was really the reason that we didn't focus on it so much, is because those anti-discrimination requirements are so widespread across most of the countries. Next question that we got is, with the variance of remote positions versus hybrid positions versus on-site only positions, I think that there's kind of two questions. One that's directly asked, which is like, how do we post ranges for those roles? And then the second one is basically like, how do those apply? And so I can maybe take that, like, how does that apply piece? And then maybe you could talk to the range question, Andrea. Does that work? Okay. So in the US, many of the pay scale transparency laws say that if an employee is remote, this isn't universal, but it's nearly universal, that if an employee is, if the position is remote and the person could work in California or in Colorado or in Washington State, for example, those laws will apply for those remote roles, because an applicant could apply from California or one of the states that has a reporting requirement. And so as a result, those are read to be quite broad. In terms of the way that the EU pay transparency directive will be viewed, so will remote roles need to include the ranges? It hasn't been decided yet. So not the EU pay transparency directive is silent on this point, and none of the drafts that we have, which again are like pretty skeletal, have gotten into that level of detail. So that's still an open question about how that will apply across the EU. But I would love to just get your thoughts on like ranges generally.
Yeah, one thing that I think we've heard as a concern from customers with these new transparency laws is you can certainly still differentiate by location. That this is not something where you suddenly have to have, if you have to disclose in different places, we can only have one range. We do see some folks who are listing out for the particular jurisdictions where they have requirements, where someone applying for a job might be in California or in Washington State or in New York City or in Colorado, having ranges for each of those, or just having sort of a blended range and saying, you know, that you would be placed in here based on geographic difference. As long as it's a reasonable range, you know, we don't want to be seeing employers who are saying you'll be paid somewhere between $50,000 and $1 million, because that doesn't fairly give an applicant an understanding of what they would be paid. But you know, as long as you're in the spirit of reasonableness, as we start to see some lawsuits following up on this, but haven't seen a whole lot yet around it, sort of the interpretation of what reasonableness means in these cases. We're you know, want to make sure that it's in the spirit of making sure people understand what they'll be paid in a role.
Yeah, great. Then we've got another, this one is also for you, is around the methodology for explaining gaps of greater than 5%. Like how are you thinking about what those controls should be? How are you approaching it?
Yep.
Great question,
This
Lauren.
is something when we work with our customers, we do it in consultation with them about, you know, how do you differentiate pay? They have to be neutral and job related. You know, something like, is this person left-handed is certainly neutral, but it is not job related. It's in terms of differentiating pay, but things like experience, particular skills, geography, location for geodifferentials are all things that we then factor into a regression analysis to explain away the gap. And we can see if once we run a regression, are we seeing a certain % difference in predicted pay? Then we would need to make adjustments.
And then another question is are we seeing that more people are going to be focusing on white men and making sure that we are addressing those issues in addition to other protected categories?
That's something that we've always, from a pay equity perspective, we've always been looking at.
Yeah.
We do bilateral analysis. We say, any group that is impacted and has in the US, a statistically significant difference. In the EU, if it's a 5% gap that we're starting to look at, if it's men, if it's, and if in the US, if it's white employees, we still want to flag that and take action on it and close those gaps no matter what. There have been lawsuits all along, in both directions, and just concern for fairness in both directions. So that it's a change in focus, but not an actual change in requirement or an activity.
And then we've got more questions around like veteran status, disability status. Can you analyze that? Can you analyze LGBTQ? All of that can be analyzed. You can analyze highest paid race. You can do any custom analysis right within the Cydio platform is to set up custom analyses. And so all of those things can be analyzed in the Cydio platform for sure. So we're at time. Thank you so much. There are so many awesome questions that will, if people put their name next to them, we'll reach out to you. And if we didn't get to them, but really great questions. Thank you all so much for being here. And we look forward to connecting with you soon.